Hey everybody, welcome back to American History to 1865. Today we're kind of wrapping up the final portion of the class with a discussion of the American Civil War. What we're going to be doing in large part during this class is really focusing on starting off with kind of the social aspects of the Civil War, kind of how it progressed and what kind of things were going on during the Civil War, but also then kind of close up with a discussion on the actual battle that took place. In your expanded content, I have a couple of videos that track the battle portion a little bit more. That's one of those areas that's more commonly covered, so I wanted to make sure that we kind of understand the social things that were going on in the background as well. So, within a week, when we last left off, we talked about the election of 1860 and how Abraham Lincoln won that election, how he was the second Republican candidate for president, the first Republican candidate to win the election, and how it was really largely his victory that led the South to secede from the Union. So, excuse me, before inauguration, so even before Lincoln was inaugurated as president, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all secede from the Union. South Carolina was the first of those to secede, so in December 20th of 1860. So it wasn't so much things that Lincoln had done as much as it was the statement that Lincoln being elected largely from votes in the North and the Electoral College in the North, and how that had an effect on the view. It was kind of the final straw for the Southerners. By February, 7 states formed the Confederate States of America. So at this point, they're a different country. They view themselves as a different country. They view themselves as a different country, and at the same time, the United States views them as states in rebellion. That's very important as we kind of go through. So, early before, as the United States and the South secedes and forms the Confederate States of America, there were early attempts at compromise, and you'll remember a lot of those border states that kind of saw the writing on the wall that if there's going to be a civil war, this is the area where they're going to fight. And you see that in Kentucky. So you have John Crittenden, who was from Kentucky, establishes what's called the Crittenden Compromise, and under this compromise, it was basically this last-ditch effort to try to get both the North and the South to agree to a continued stalemate. And that stalemate would do two things. It would guarantee the permanent existence of slavery in the South, and then it would reestablish the Missouri Compromise line. So basically, any territories that would expand, or any territories that the United States would expand into, would still, under the Missouri Compromise, anything north of 3630 would be free. Anything south of 3630 would be slave. Now, this is really interesting because there were several reasons why Southerners and Northerners both didn't like this anymore. The idea of popular sovereignty, or allowing individuals to vote on whether or not they are going to be free or slave, was at issue. The idea of extending the 3630 line was at issue. The 3630 line was interesting because at this point, it was still kind of viewed as a possibility that the United States would, in the earlier territorial area, so 1840, 1850, when the view of the Mexican territory was in doubt, when it was a possibility that the United States would eventually end up with all of Mexico, the 3630 line would mean that if you had Mexico, then all of the U.S. territories in Mexico would be open to slavery. Now, the problem with the extension of the Missouri Compromise line, even after the southern border of the United States had been set, is that the Republicans, at this point, even if they weren't necessarily supporting black freedom and equality, they were against the expansion of slavery. And by extending the Missouri Compromise line, it would allow slavery to expand. So like I said earlier, Lincoln was one of these individuals who focused on allowing slavery to continue in the South, but not letting it expand into any new territory. In his mind, this would mean that the Southern economy, the Southern slave economy, would eventually die out. And this was kind of the moderate Republican view. It was also kind of largely the majority Republican view. Very few Republicans were absolute abolitionists. And people who were absolute abolitionists were kind of on the fringe of the party. And so Republicans reject this Crittenden Compromise. Obviously, the South rejects the compromise. And Major Robert Anderson holds Fort Sumter. And it's attacked by Confederate soldiers on April 12th and 13th of 1861. But following a two-day bombardment, Anderson surrenders the fort on April 14th, 1861, which is the official start of the American Civil War. Now, as the war kind of develops, this becomes kind of an interesting dichotomy here. The North had a population that was twice as large as the South. They also had an economy built on advanced industry. Now, when you have an economy built on trade and industry, generally you will have a pretty sophisticated transportation system, which they did. They also had a material advantage where they had a broader, because of the industrial system, they had broader access to supplies, they had broader access to transportation, they had more materials. So even if it comes down to making bandages or making uniforms, things like that, the North had an advantage there. Now, the South was fighting a defensive war, which is beneficial, because the farther the North pushes into the South, they are now having to secure territory. They're not defending territory; they're securing territory, and the Southern morale was much higher than the Northern morale. They also had a large cotton export that was industrial, so they had resources in terms of financial resources, but they didn't necessarily have the material resources that the North had. So you have kind of pros and cons on each side here in terms of military advantages. Now, the Northern war machine was very large, and it was really built on rewarding military service, so taking advantage of the higher population and rewarding military service. So in 1862, you had the Homestead Act, which became very important as the United States kind of pushes west following the Civil War. The Homestead Act actually gave 160 acres of land to individuals for just a small fee, with the promise that they would cultivate that land. What that did is that allowed the United States to rapidly expand west. So in the meantime, while the Civil War is being fought, the American North, the United States, is pushing west. It also, following the Morrill Act, transferred land to states to sell in order to fund education. So you have this education system now that is being built in the North. And this helped establish these major land grant institutions, such as Texas A&M, Michigan State, Oklahoma State University, things like that. So these state universities. You also had the creation of the Union Pacific Railroad Company and the Central Pacific Railroad Company in order to create a transcontinental railroad. So if you'll remember last lecture, we talked about the debate over where the railroad was going to go. Is the railroad going to go through the south or going to go through the north? Well, since the north had the resources, they say, okay, well, we're going to take the Union Pacific from Omaha and the Central Pacific from California, and we are going to connect them, through the north. So now you're cutting off this southern rail line. In many ways, they're taking advantage of the separation from the south in order to accomplish these tasks that they wanted to accomplish, such as building a transcontinental railroad. And in order to increase the kind of willingness of these railroad companies to create this railroad, is that they would kind of use a checkerboard system, and they'd give loans and land to these companies in order to, so basically all along the rail route, every alternating territories of several dozen acres would belong to the railroad, and so you'd have stations and you'd have the ability for people to buy some of this land, but then alternating the land would belong to the railroads. You also had, near the end of the war, the establishment of the National Banking Acts. The Bank Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a new and improved system of federal banking. And it allowed banks to join the system if they had enough capital and they would invest in the government. So this is a way to raise money for the federal government to fight the war effort. And it would, in return, allow them to issue national banknotes. And this became very important. And it became important because, as we've talked about before, it allowed the government to issue what were called greenbacks, or paper dollars. Greenbacks were not backed by silver or gold. They were basically, the value would fluctuate based on the fortunes of the Union. And so while it was almost kind of like a stock in the United States, now this allowed this allowed banks to facilitate trade. This allowed smaller banks to issue government-backed banknotes, and it allowed the stability of the larger size of the federal government system in order to support these banknotes. At the same time, Congress levied the first income tax. And so you have the banking system that is collecting money for the federal government, Congress collecting taxes from the American populace. You also have the Treasury selling what were called war bonds, where you would buy a war bond from the Treasury, and then after a period, they would pay you back that bond with interest. The war bonds raised about $400 million during that time. Now, in terms of the actual Northern War Machine, you had in 1861 just about 16,000 regulars, which is kind of the extent of the government army, which obviously is not enough to fight a war. Congress, based on that number, authorized the enlistment of volunteers. And then following that, in March of 1963, Congress actually passed a national draft. And following this national draft, many Northerners began to riot. There was a riot in New York City in July of 1863 in which 100 rioters died. So the popular sentiment wasn't necessarily in support of the war, especially many farther Northerners who viewed it more favorable to kind of cut off the South and let them go than to fight for reunification. And in many cases, Northerners blamed not only Black Americans in the North, but also slaves in the South for the war, basically saying this is their fault. I didn't want this war, and we shouldn't be fighting a war for them. So again, this is this supporting this argument that just because you lived in the North doesn't mean that you were an abolitionist. Just because you lived in the North doesn't mean that you were focused on equality for Black Americans or Black people in general. And even if you lived in the North doesn't even mean that you were against the institution of slavery. So trying to dispel some of those simplistic views of the what was going on in the North and in the South. Now, in terms of Northern politics, Abraham Lincoln, who kind of goes down in history as one of the more popular presidents, had a tendency to ignore inconvenient parts of the U.S. Constitution. He took several actions that were in direct opposition to the U.S. Constitution. He sent troops without asking for a war declaration from Congress. He increased the size of the military. He enforced a naval blockade without approval. He ordered the military arrest of dissenters. He suspended habeas corpus rights, which is basically the requirement that a person must appear before a judge, and essentially enforced permanent detention. And even though he is kind of skirting around these inconvenient parts of the Constitution in ways that would be, especially in today's polarized times, would be, a one-way ticket to impeachment, because only the North is voting, Lincoln is very popular. So since the North is primarily Republican at this time, he easily wins re-election, following important victories in the Civil War. So basically, even though he is taking controversial, what would be today very controversial actions, because he's taken them in an essentially one-party nation, he is still very popular. Now, one of the ways in which Abraham Lincoln tried to transform the Civil War and justify the Civil War through this anti-slavery cause is by the issuance of several actions. In 1861, he issued the Confiscation Act, which declared slaves used for the Southern war effort to be free. Again, this is still towing the line between whether or not a slave is an individual person or property. And the Confiscation Act kind of relies on the idea that slaves are property, and that because they are property used in rebellion against the United States, that they can be confiscated by the United States. He follows up on this by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in July 11th of 1863, which freed all slaves in the Confederate States in rebellion. So basically, we think of the Emancipation Proclamation as outlawing slavery, when in actuality it is freeing all the slaves in these Confederate states, in these states in rebellion. Now, obviously, if you're in the South and you're in a state of rebellion, you consider yourself a separate country, so you consider the law of the North or the United States not to apply to you. Whereas, again, this is just kind of how it is viewed. Whereas in the North, if you're viewing these as states that are still in the United States but states in rebellion, that's kind of a different situation, right? So what you see in the North is paper money driving prices up about 80%. So you see inflation, but it's quite a bit of inflation, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, not nearly as bad as it could be. And as in most wartime scenarios where you have men moving into the military, many women move into traditionally male jobs. By 1865, women were the dominant sex in the nursing field, and by 1900, they were almost exclusive in the nursing field. And that's lasted up until even the modern era, where you still have a majority of females in a majority of nurses in the nursing career, females. And so what we've seen before and what you really see following the Civil War is that during wartime, it's very common for men to move into the military and women to move into those positions that men vacate. And then following the war, it's a struggle for basically the men who were fighting the war, trying to evict the women from the positions the gaps that they filled. And so that was kind of the state of the North. Now, when we go to the South very quickly establishes a government in Richmond, Virginia, and they elect Jefferson Davis, who was a U.S. congressman, to a 6-year term as president. So he was the only president in the history of the Confederate States of America. And while Davis was generally a good detail administrator, was good at kind of working out details, he was not a terribly effective leader. He had a tendency to micromanage, which anybody who's worked at any sort of fast food restaurant can probably attest to the fact that micromanaging from a manager is not good for business. And we'll talk about that later, and how that type of leadership worked. Now, one of the things that the Confederate States tried to do was not tax the population. But if you don't tax the population, you're not going to have money to fight the war effort. And Southerners very quickly lost faith in government bonds and stopped buying them. And what you saw is that each bank began to issue its own paper currency. And this was, like we talked about before, when you have the issuance of several different varieties of paper currency, you don't have the ability to regulate pricing. And prices soar 9,000%. That's not a typo. Prices soar 9,000%, which meant inflation, out of control inflation. And money essentially becomes worthless. Paper money becomes worthless. So you have really this inability to buy anything, buy the necessities, and to really counteract this, you have the Southern Conscription Act, which allows an exemption to anyone with 20 or more slaves, which was incredibly controversial because it basically reinforces this Southern aristocracy. And between 1864 and 1865, there were about 100,000 desertions. So even though the Southern morale was very high in the beginning, the longer drawn out this war goes on, or the more drawn out the war becomes, the less Southerners are willing to fight it, especially following the establishment of really a de facto food draft. And the food draft essentially allowed soldiers to eat off of any farms that they traveled through. So you had the Southern military kind of moving through. They don't have enough money to be fed, so they implemented a food draft so they would roll through a farm and just pick all the crops out of the field and eat them. And to the point where you have the Southern military fighting in Southern territory, raiding Southern farms in order to have food, and it has a severe impact on morale. You also saw the South rigidly enforcing their slave codes in order to prevent uprisings, in order to try to not have to fight on two fronts. Now, in terms of the strategy of the war, it was largely conducted by two individuals. Ulysses S. Grant managed much of the Northern War effort under Lincoln, and Lincoln was focused on destroying the Confederate Army, not occupying land, which was beneficial in some senses and not in others. If you're occupying land, you need a much larger force. because you have to take and hold land. But at the same time, if you're trying to eliminate an opposing military, you are basically having to hunt them down wherever they go, which can be very difficult, especially if you're fighting in southern land that you're not accustomed to. In the South, Robert E. Lee was established as the principal military advisor. And like we said, Davis shared very little control of the war effort, which was really probably one of the downfalls, because you have a military genius such as Robert E. Lee. So really you have two military geniuses here playing kind of this chess match. And between Grant and Lee, both had served as U.S. military leaders, rose through the ranks in the U.S. military system, and one of the main differences is that Lincoln took a much more collaborative approach with his military leadership, whereas Jefferson Davis took a very hands-on approach and allowed very little control to Robert E. Lee, who was the military superior between the two of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. So the Union starts the war fairly early by establishing a fairly weak blockade. The United States Navy was serviceable at the time, but the South sent an ironclad warship named the Virginia to scatter the blockade. Now, it was effective at first, but shortly after, the United States sends the Union, the Union sends the Monitor. So these are two ironclad naval ships, and they engage in a naval battle, basically shooting back and forth. And the reason this is important is because this is kind of the introduction of modern technology. Before this, you have ironclad ships firing against old wooden vessels. Ironclad ships are very effective against wooden vessels, but when you have two ironclad ships firing cannonballs at each other, they're just bouncing off, and the two engage in an essentially inconclusive naval battle. You didn't really see a ton of naval warfare after that unless it was along the Mississippi. Now, the South at the beginning of the Civil War had hoped that their export of cotton would serve them in enlisting the aid of the English. They had hoped that English reliance on cotton would allow them to kind of have support and even military support. They kind of viewed this as a second revolution. But the North was able to effectively keep Britain and France out of the conflict through kind of threats and diplomacy. And one of the main ways that they did this was calling out Britain for selling ships to the South, which would be later addressed diplomatically. And it created grievances with the North, but the North didn't take any military action. So they're trying to, even though Britain is trying to support the South in some ways, the North is basically keeping this a very localized military conflict. If you would have had the military might of Britain brought in, it might have been different, but the North was effective in keeping Great Britain out of the war. Now, over the course of the war, 618,000 American soldiers died. And the first battle of the war took place what was the first battle of Bull Run, or the first battle of Manassas on July 21st, of 1861. Now, this is at the time when the Southern morale is very high, and the North, the Northern Army, the Northern military is fairly small, and the first Battle of Bull Run was a tremendous failure for the Union, and this was the first time that the Union realized that the war would be long, that it wouldn't be a quick, hey, slap on the wrist, bring you back in the fold kind of thing. And that was fairly critical, because after that, the North kind of adjusts, tries to adjust expectations. And during the course of the war, the Union General George McClellan, quote unquote, liberated the people of the mountains in Virginia and establishes West Virginia in 1863. You also had the Union David Farragut captured New Orleans with a naval assault in 1862. So by 1862, the Union controls the Mississippi River. So it's difficult generally to just kind of talk and not show maps. So I really want to kind of go through and highlight what I'm talking about here. So from 1862, Farragut comes up, captures New Orleans. By controlling the Mississippi River, you've effectively cut the South in half, because now Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas over here are all cut off from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Even though all of these are the heart of the Confederate States, you still lack support here. So if you've lost your support from Arkansas, Missouri, Louisiana, Texas over here, it becomes much more difficult to carry on this campaign. And as you can see, really throughout this area, Farragut captures Mobile, Alabama in 1864. After the initial push from the South, most of the battles are taking place really from the North. And so let's go over each of those. So General McClellan, generally showed little desire to engage the Southerners in the East. And his peninsular campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia, was repelled by Stonewall Jackson, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And the armies met at Antietam Creek. And they engaged in the bloodiest battle of the war. 6,000 killed, 17,000 wounded. And this is early in the course of the war, kind of in the middle. And so what you have is George McClellan really becoming ineffective in the eyes of Abraham Lincoln. So what he does is he relieves him from duty. On July 1st through 3rd of 1863, Robert E. Lee attempts to push toward Washington and met Joseph Hooker at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And during the battle at Gettysburg, Lee orders Pickett's charge, which was 15,000 Confederates trying to charge over 1 mile of open field. And there's a lot of speculation about Pickett's charge in terms of its effect and effectiveness, but only 5,000 make it up the ridge, and the remnants surrender and retreat. So the South would never again threaten Northern territory after Gettysburg in 1863. so we have here the Western Front of the war, and the reason I'm hesitating here is because some of my images are lost in here. So as you watch in the expanded content, take a look at how this northeastern front kind of proceeded. Following this initial push, in 1864, Ulysses S. Grant becomes the general-in-chief of the Union armies, and he marches on Petersburg, Virginia, which essentially cuts off Richmond's supplies. So going back to Richmond here, by cutting off the supplies, you've essentially cut off the head of the Confederate States. And General William Sherman was able to capture Atlanta on September 2nd in 1864. So once he captures Atlanta in 1864, he begins his march to the sea, basically marching down towards Savannah, up toward Columbia, up to Raleigh in 1865. And the march to the sea allows basically the complete cutting off of the Confederate States' ability to supply Richmond, to supply its troops. And in 1865, Grant captures Petersburg and forces the Confederates out of Richmond. So forcing them out of Richmond essentially cuts off the head of the Confederate States. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee meets Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, signing the peace treaty that effectively ends the American Civil War. I know that's quick and dirty. I know that's really glossing over the actual battle portion, but it is covered a little bit more in depth in your book, covered in the expanded content as well. But for our purposes, it's really important more to understand not necessarily how the battles took place, because you've covered that in high school. And if you really want to cover that, you can cover that in further college studies. But for our purpose, it's important to know what led to those particular developments. Why did the North have, what led to them having more materials, a more effective military strategy, and kind of how that developed. So that's the last PowerPoint for the semester. Make sure that you are reading the sections in the book, continuing the expanded content, following along, and preparing for the final exam. Thank you for your attention this course, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your semester, and don't forget to enroll for the next semester.